Okay, jumping right into our next session, the best practices session, which is truly a powerhouse panel moderated by Jacke Falla, who is of Elaine Construction, but she is also a 2020 award winner from IFMA Boston and our podcast host for the FMForward Podcast. So the panel that she will be moderating includes Ryan DeStefano, Vice President of Global Assistance Services from On Call International, David Trout, Enterprise Preparedness from Raytheon Company, Kevin Ruby, Director of Annual Capital Projects from Boston College, Dan Chadwick, Vice President at Fidelity Investments, and Ashley Guzman, Manager Business Continuity and Crisis Management at Liberty Mutual Insurance. All of their bios are available on Whova, so please check out them for more information about them. And Jacke, I believe you hope to take questions at the end of this session, so please hold your questions there or use the chat, but you can always ask them via Whova. And with that being said, Jacke, take it away.
Thanks, Tom. I'm actually going to just clarify quickly. We will take questions as we move through it, because I've formatted this particular session like 60 minutes. We're going to have it broken down into 3-part harmony for you all. And we'll kick off with business continuity, then we'll move into construction risk, and then we'll end with the big bang of active assailant training, and also known as active shooter training. And in each interim, we'll break out and address some questions for 5 minutes in between each. So it'll work best if everybody feels free to ask their questions while the actual speaker for that subject matter is in conversation. So thank you again, Tom. When I raised the idea of addressing the millennial audience and perhaps doing that through a podcast, I don't think I knew what I was getting myself into, but we've had a lot of fun, and I have learned so much from my speakers. It's been pretty incredible. And when we began it, as Tom mentioned, we began with the inaugural episodes addressing risk in all its myriad forms. So we uncovered in dusty old drawers business continuity plans, and addressed disgruntled employees, and found construction risk not only on the site but lurking in the planning room as well. So we're going to dive into that discussion with you all right now. So Ashley, could you first explain what business continuity planning is all about?
Okay, it's a big topic, but basically it is the ability of a company to have a plan in place so that when a crisis happens, that you're able to keep business operations going, or if they're interrupted, to restart them. So the way that organizations typically look at business continuity can be in 3 phases. So one is, what do you do in the immediate phase of the emergency? Second, what is the structure to managing that emergency, so through the crisis phase? And then business recovery. So what do you do for those operations that either need help in recovering because there's been a work stoppage, or how do you keep those operations going through the crisis and back to normal operations? So that's typically how most organizations do it. I would say the caveat to that is no organization does it exactly the same. So that's kind of part of the challenge and the interest in the work for me, is being able to work within my organization now, and having worked in other places might do it slightly different depending on the environment.
Sure. So Ashley, tell me a little bit about who gets involved in this. So I know you're a business continuity specialist. So that tells me that you don't just, since you work for Liberty Mutual full time, you're not just creating a singular plan and then walking away forever. So how does it evolve, and who is involved in the development of a plan?
Best practice, I would say the entire organization. It's not every single individual, of course, depending on the size. But it really means that the business units and individuals like myself from a business continuity group are working together to develop the plan. Really, plans are best managed at the business level, so they have ownership of it. They know their processes best. So you're going to make sure that you develop that plan really hand in hand with them.
Okay,
And
excellent.
I was just going to add,
Go
best
ahead.
case, all of your employees understand what to do in an emergency. So that's also handled different ways. It may be that they have access to the emergency plan itself that's been developed, or that they've been trained in specific aspects of what to do, whether it's, from an evacuation or a shelter in place situation, even all the way up to a pandemic situation like we've encountered now with COVID-19.
Sure. So why don't you give our listeners an example of one of those things? So a crisis, you pick whatever your favorite crisis is, Ashley. Pick one of them and talk us through exactly how that plan that you've already developed would carry out.
Mm-hmm. I don't think I have a favorite crisis, but I can tell you kind of the basic
You have a least
structure.
favorite?
A pandemic, no, right now. No, but just basically, I think best case, we try to develop plans in a way in what we call an all hazards format. So the concept is that you could pick up that plan, and no matter what the genesis of that crisis is, you could use it. And the way we do it in Liberty Mutual is we actually look at the impacts of what that crisis is. So we do planning, the caveat to that, we do planning around, we think of natural disasters, we think of power outage, we think of network outage, we think of pandemic events. We do have some specific planning around those hazards. But the plans in the best case, they're developed to be picked up whatever that crisis is, whatever that hazard event has happened, and then be able to utilize throughout the process that I mentioned earlier. So you know what to do immediately when something happens. You have a team together that has trained, has worked together, understands how to manage that crisis event, and then supports the business all the way through recovery and hopefully back to normal, or you often will hear, new normal.
Right.
Usually things are not exactly the same after the event happens. And part of that ongoing process is when we're not dealing with an event, it's planning, it's training, it's mitigating for the next event that will happen.
Sure. And, we get a lot of weather-related events here. So I know the pandemic has been really special, and it's required a lot of scenario planning on your part. And if our audience members are interested, they'll ask some questions around that. But I want to talk about just a few of the things that the plan is trying to highlight for employees in, say, a hurricane situation. Mm-hmm. We know that we're going to have floods. We know we're going to have some, potential resiliency issues, right? So what do the employees know to do based on your Liberty Mutual business continuity plan when Cristobal is going to land in Boston?
Mm-hmm. So part of our planning is around what to do because of the impact of that crisis event. So in a hurricane situation, it would be that they would know what to do if the location is impacted. They would know what to do if staffing is impacted in the group they work in. So whether that's transferring that work to another organization in a different location of employees who are up and running and continue to do that work, whether it's work stoppage, whether it's transferring that work to a vendor, that's all laid out in the plan. We also work through what happens if any of the applications or systems that those employees in the operation rely upon, if they go down, if they have an outage, including network outages. And then another major area besides applications and systems are vendors. So we also have strategies in our plans for if vendors that operation relies upon, if they have an outage, say due to that hurricane, an example that you're using, so they know what to do. And so they can continue that work or transfer that work to another vendor. You know, it really depends on that operation, and that planning piece is what we walk through and help them to have a good understanding, so that when that hurricane hits, one, they're working ahead of time to keep the employees safe, of course, that's number one, but then they have a plan all the way through the phase of that event of what to do.
Okay, super. Yeah, so I think it sounds like communication is really, really important. So even though people have been trained, you're ramping up the communication, I imagine, around any particular event. And how does that work? Does it go out in emails? Is there a business continuity task force that's in charge of the communication? Does human resources handle it? How does it work? And is there a best practice around it?
So it really, I would say, is a little bit situation dependent. For COVID-19, I can tell you we have a full enterprise-wide task force that's working now and concurrently throughout this event to make sure communication happens at all the right levels, at the individual employee level, at the manager level, that we have many channels that we're trying to get the word out. We have, just for COVID-19, for example, we have a web page kind of tile that employees can link to where they can get all the latest information. We have communications that are going out by email to managers that are specific for information they need to know. We have video chats, we have webinars that are being done by leadership in order to communicate with employees. So it really can take a wide range of channels, depending on the event. For a hurricane event, often what we've done in the past is we will start monitoring, we have monitoring in place within the organization, and a few days ahead we'll work with the local crisis management team in the affected area or areas that we think likely will be impacted. We'll work with them. They often will communicate on their own to employees because we really do believe in partnership at the local level. They know their areas best, better than I would from a corporate standpoint, for example. But we have an open communication between us and those individuals who are designated to lead that process. And then they'll turn around and work with their crisis management teams and their employees at the local level. We also employ,
Ashley, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I do want to see if there are any audience questions, because it's business continuity planning is a pretty big undertaking, and there's actually a lot of study around how to roll out a program. So, Janessa, do we have any audience questions right now?
None that have come through, hold on, none in chat, but if people have them, feel free to unmute yourself and ask one. Let me just check Huva as well. And no, I don't have any yet. Does anyone want to? Feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand if that makes you feel more comfortable. Or you can ask it anonymously to me and I can say it to the group.
All right, then I'm going to ask one more question of Ashley before we take our commercial break and move into the breakout rooms. So Ashley, since this is really about risk, talk to me about the risk of not having a business continuity plan. Liberty Mutual is a really enormous company, and some of our listeners might be from much smaller organizations. How important is it for them to have a business continuity plan, or is there no difference between big and small?
I think everyone should have a business continuity plan, but I'm biased because of the work I do. I think everyone should be prepared. It really, the size and complexity of that plan, right, would differ depending on the organization. I can tell you, the company, the size that I work for, we have, well over 200 business processes identified with plans. Obviously, if you're a small organization or a small business, that's going to be much smaller. I can just give an example. I had the fortune of working with a good friend of mine locally. And they have an essential business they've kept running throughout COVID-19. And they kept talking to me about wanting to have a business continuity plan and never quite got around to it. And now as they move through this event, they contact me again, and I said, honestly, it's too late right now for us to do a business continuity plan, to really go through a business impact analysis and do the thoughtful ahead of time planning that really is key to that process. However, what I was able to do is give them some, quick hit advice of things that I would suggest they do to try to manage through the crisis. And that's the big key takeaway, I think, Jackie, is that's the investment in doing business continuity planning, no matter the size of your organization. I'd even say as one person, even if you're, an individual running your business, you should have something in place for what would happen if something were to happen to you. So just think of your customers on an individual level. If something happens to you, how do they continue to get those services? So, business continuity plan doesn't have to be big and complex. It's not rocket science, I always say, but it really should be thoughtfully done ahead of crisis. And then I think you're always pitch hitting. That's part of the reality of this. A hurricane is not a hurricane, is not a hurricane. And I think that's part of the challenge for people who are not in the field, is they think they can have a formula for every event. And I would say you could have a framework and a playbook to help guide you.
Oh, that's wonderful. All right, let's break. Any types of risk to a client: budget, schedule, safety. I wanted to break each of those items down. So Dan, would you please start with schedule and tell us how Fidelity approaches or mitigates this particular area of risk?
Well, from a schedule standpoint, I think that the way we approach it, and probably most people do, I guess, but the schedule is there for you to understand, obviously the duration of the project and the tasks associated with it. And I think it also naturally gives you an exercise to understand your risk in a project, right? Just by going through the line items and the tasks. So for us, obviously when we see a schedule impact, or we start to see something coming up, that gives us the ability to be proactive and say, look, what are we going to do if this happens? I didn't put in my schedules this year for a pandemic, so that was kind of outside of the norm, obviously. But those things that you say, if you have an exterior project or something like that, and that you're going to have some down days just due to weather. You build that into your schedule, so you can understand, risk impacts there.
Is there anything in particular? You're a veteran, you've been doing this for some time, that becomes glaringly obvious when you look at a schedule, or do you look specifically for tells in some area? Do you go, when you look at the schedule, it arrives in a proposal, do you go, nah, that thing will never work? And how do you know? Like, what are you looking for?
I'm looking for detail mostly. Just understanding through the different phases of a project, what happens. Sorry, I'm getting these things popping up on me. I look at each phase, the pre-construction, the design, and then obviously the procurement and the construction. So, what is it that is missing is what I'm trying to find out, because the things that get overlooked, I think sometimes, is that the project scheduler may not put in the procurement timeline. They'll put in the construction, but they don't make and it's a simple mistake, but you don't want to miss that, because you're gonna miss your deadline, because you didn't build something like that simple thing in, so.
Sure. Okay, that's great. Kevin, I want to pop over to you to discuss budget for a moment, because trust me,
curveball.
When I do, hey, it's so good to see you. When I do my own construction budgets, I do not have the expertise that we have here at Elaine Construction. Just let me tell you that. I'm no mathematician or financial wizard. But I'm not happy when I have an overage, when my builder tells me something has gone astray and I'm going to have to pay more money. So Kevin, talk to me about how you protect the institutional interests, and what are all the types of risks that come from trying to manage a budget in construction.
Nobody's happy when there's unforeseen costs or we're over budget. I think one of the advantages of being on a campus and having any number of buildings of the same vintage, we start to see a lot of similar unforeseen conditions, because we have a whole group of buildings built between 1950 and 1970, so very similar types of construction. So that helps us to build in our project contingencies and justifying that contingency. The finance people like to just put a 10% on it, and when we're in the very first meeting about a project, and we're talking about our contingencies are starting at 30% because we have no idea what the project is leading to.
Sure.
We try to defend that with past work on campus and the risks that have been involved with those that we're aware of. So
that's interesting, Kevin. So tell me, so if it starts at a 30%, that's a way to mitigate it, right? To kind of pad the number, if you will.
Yeah, and that's typically before we started any design. That's we're putting an initial order of magnitude cost together on a project.
Right, and as you move through, you're getting more clarity. So talk to our audience here about how you get that clarity. Maybe we can target something like destructive testing as a way of describing how you mitigate this area of risk.
Yes, and like Dan was talking about, pre-construction phases, I think oddly enough, some people have different opinions on it. I think it's invaluable or extremely valuable. It's specifically for going in and cutting a hole in a wall that hasn't been touched in 60 years is, there's no documentation of what might be in there or what might not be in there. Is it actually a shaft, or is it just a chase wall? Things like that. So we try to focus on good pre-construction activities, including destructive testing, as well as being an architect. I'm an architect myself. My background is so always trying to give the design team enough time to design. If your good documents are
good point,
always reduce your risk on a project, but the powers that be, especially trying to fit into an academic schedule, if we're looking at being open when classes start in September, that's sometimes it is what it is. But.
No question. Before we jump off of this, talk to us a tiny bit about procurement risk. So Dan alluded to it when he was talking about schedule, and for all of our listeners, I think it makes sense to state the obvious here that budget and schedule are almost inextricably linked together. There's always you do something in the schedule, it impacts the budget, right? Dan, you agree with this, right?
Yeah. From a procurement standpoint, I think that, you have to know what kind of time you have and what the expectation there is. And then understanding that if you're picking a tile from Italy, that it's going to take longer to get, so understand your supply chain and make sure that you do the due diligence there, and make sure that you have the conversation with your architects and engineers that, they clearly understand the schedule and they understand that, our procurement activities have to be in line with that. So, I think that's the first thing. So when it comes to procurement.
Sure. So Kevin, I think, Dan, you're absolutely right that you have to have a keen focus, particularly today, on the procurement issues. Kevin, talk to me about the reality that, some of these projects are, super fast. Summer slammers. We're talking 8 to 12-week projects. If it takes me 16 weeks just to get an elevator and our supply chain now is blown up, how are you managing that?
Yeah, so again, our academic schedule puts a whole nother challenge to procurement lead times. So if we don't know what we're doing in the summer by the middle of March, we have problems in a lot of areas. You know, furniture, forget about the pandemic. I mean, furniture we'll typically budget 8 to 12 weeks for furniture. You know, doors the last few years have been a challenge in terms of lead times. They can go, you know, as many as 8 weeks just to procure doors. So
lights are a nightmare.
Oh yeah, lighting is, and you know, and since 2008 or whatever it was, you know, a lot of these manufacturers aren't stocking anything, so everything's coming. It's not stocking it locally. Everything's coming from, you know, the other side of the country or something. So it's if basically we need to know what we're doing by the middle of March, or chances are it's going to be a real challenge to hit our schedule of being done before students get back.
Right, and just to circle back to that idea of budget, you know, if the furniture doesn't arrive, even if you happen to have extra furniture in a storage closet, that equals budgetary dollars, because they're not walking themselves over to the building and setting up, right, for the classroom. So that gets tacked on to your construction budget, right? You've got to pay somebody else's department to manage that. So all of these things tie back into the overall budget.
Exactly.
It's really, and it'll be interesting to see what happens to inventory and supplies, and whether or not we move away from a real-time delivery of things based on the pandemic. But that's a topic for another day. So let's tackle quickly here probably the most obvious challenge or risk that people think about when they think about construction, and that's the safety risk. Kevin, why don't you just continue on, and then we'll have Dan tackle the question, because I do think that there's a pretty significant difference for academic institutions when they think about construction safety versus corporate and commercial buildings. So tell us why you think, you know, what that difference is for the academic institution.
Well, the obvious ones are students. You know, every 50 to 60 minutes throughout the day in the academic year is, you know, there's lower campus, there could be a concentration of 6,000 students walking around trying to get, you know, some lunch before they go off to their next class or whatnot. And they all have habits of how they get from point A to point B. So if we're interrupting the path that they take every day and they're not paying any attention, you know, looking at their phone or just whatever.
But aren't students really good at paying attention and the signs that say do not enter and things like that?
Hopefully in the classroom they are, but we've, you know, being on campuses for about 14 years now, I could argue that signage is a waste of money. So we try to focus more on physical barriers, and by that I mean, you know, obviously sight fence, but even pipe rail and cones and canes, and not caution tape, because, you know, that's sort of ignored as well, because I've had one of my first crane jobs on a campus. We had everything surrounded with caution tape, and students walked up and lifted the tape and walked underneath it, right underneath the hoist of the crane. And
isn't that an Instagrammable moment?
probably should have been. The response was, it said caution. It didn't say do not enter.
Yeah.
So,
well, there you have it. There you have it. So that is very, very different than the corporate and commercial world. Now, of course, there are some similarities. Dan, why don't you tell us, Do your employees follow the rules? Do regular civilians, are they doing what they're supposed to do as it relates to minding ongoing construction? No, they're not. Okay, give us the skinny on it.
I mean, some do, some don't. I think that, but that's the important point made by Kevin, that we have to be able to block off effectively a construction area. Obviously, corporate interiors is a little simpler than ground up construction, obviously. But I think that we have to be mindful to understand where the gray areas are. Here's the construction wall or the zip wall or whatever you want. And then here's a common corridor, right? And behind the wall is a construction site. So we have to make sure that, those gray areas, that like the common spaces, don't have tripping hazards or people don't have the ability to get into the construction site. Obviously, the construction site has to be extremely clean, because somebody does want to peek behind the curtain and they'll go in and they'll just walk around. This is going to be my new space. And, somebody might have open-toed shoes and kick a metal stud, or something like that.
Right.
So, again, cleanliness and signage and, barriers where possible are extremely important for our sites.
All right,
So,
super.
and then trying to get people to understand not to peek behind the curtain.
I know,
Save
their
it for the-
curiosity gets the best of them, right? In a way, we should talk about how we can feed that curiosity safely. But I do want to ask folks if they have any questions before we take our next commercial break.
We have one question. We have a few. So, pandemic aside, what's the craziest reason for a delay in construction you've encountered?
I should cut out there a little. What was it?
Oh.
Dan, pandemic aside, what's the craziest risk that you have seen in construction?
The craziest risk?
Is that what it said, Janessa?
No, the
Risk?
craziest reason for delay.
Oh,
Pandemic
reason for
aside,
delay, sorry.
I haven't had too many. I think one project we had, it was a construction, a new constructed building. It had been designed, it was ready to break ground on a Monday. And the project was canceled on the Friday before. And it was a big project too. So,
Wow.
but
What happened? Why did it get canceled?
Somebody changed their mind about doing it.
Oh.
Very high up.
Kevin, what happened with you? You've been at Harvard Business School, you're at Boston College now, you've seen some stuff.
Yeah, and I think they've all been probably related to noise. Certain people respond differently to things like the warning signal of a truck backing up when it's going all day, and depending on if that's the right person, they can actually shut down a project for several hours because they're tired of listening to the beep of the trucks backing up. So that's generally what we're up against with, occupied construction, and it's not just on campus. I'm sure Dan deals with it as well. Noise is the noise can also often cause delays.
We missed your remark, Dan. Say it again.
Oh, so I was going to say, there was one time, and I think this was at the Harvard Business School campus. There wasn't a project delayed for a day or something because a crane operator got attacked by an eagle or something, by a hawk.
Yeah, a hawk.
So
yeah, it was the tower crane on Tata Hall. The operator was climbing the tower, and in the adjacent buildings, which is Soldier Field Park, there was a hawk nest, whatever you call it. And as this guy was returning from lunch and climbing up the tower, the hawk swooped in and sliced his arm open. He had 12 or 14 stitches, something like that.
Oh my word.
And then about 2 weeks after that, there was a raccoon as up, he encountered a raccoon. So.
Oh my word! All right, beat that, you other
Yeah.
FM forward presenters. All right, should we answer another question, or did you want to pop into the breakout room? You're on mute, Janice.
I think we should go into the breakout rooms in interest of time, but if we have another, it's in the chat. If folks want to, we can bring it up at the end if folks haven't, if we don't have other questions.
Super.
All right.
All right, breakout room it
Here
is.
we go.
Active assailant training, which Ryan and David both let me know was the appropriate term, because there are lots of different types of threats that can come at you, not just from a gun. So, Ryan, can you explain to me the importance of active assailant training? Why do it?
So I think the easiest answer is what we generally refer to as duty of care. And I can't recall if we talked about this on the podcast or not, but many of the facility managers on this call and who listen should be familiar with the OSHA version of duty of care, providing a safe workplace. But when we expand that and talk about it for international travel or any other risks, we kind of talk about the general, legal and moral obligation for a company to provide reasonable care against foreseeable risk. And so when you think of active assailant, and nobody has to tell anybody, I don't think, if you read the news and follow along on how often it happens in various sectors, whether it's a workplace, a theater, a school, a concert, a protest rally where a car drives into a group of protesters, like a couple of days ago. So those types of active threats happen in every sector, in a regular occurrence. So to say it's foreseeable risk, it certainly is. It's something we can't turn our head away from and pretend doesn't exist, or pretend it's not going to happen in our facility or to our sector. So then it gets to what's the reasonable care you should be providing to mitigate or prevent that risk. And any of the literature you'd read, and any of the guidelines, even OSHA's guidelines when they come in to do an inspection after an incident, talks about training. Have you trained your people on what to do during an emergency? So if we demystify the active shooter, active assailant piece of it, it just really gets down to the core of providing a safe and secure workplace.
That's great. So if anybody popped on and kind of heard our pre-conversation, that's actually what we were talking about, is this idea of benchmarking with other similar type companies or size companies. If the average or the majority of them are conducting some kind of active assailant training, you should probably be doing it too. So that's this idea of the duty of care extended into what's happening with everybody else. So David, I want to ask you, because there are so many different variations of training, and at Raytheon you've done kind of the most comprehensive, which is a live incident training. You've conducted that, and I want you to talk to our audience a little bit about why you've done it like that and what's it all about.
Thanks, Jackie. First of all, what I want to explain is that for Raytheon, why we went down this path was, pre-pandemic, this was always in the news, and it really did have everyone's attention. And I was in the facilities organization before moving over to environmental health and safety. And so it was always important, but, where people spend a third of their lives at work, or used to, and you had personality dynamics along with different stressors, it's sort of that perfect cauldron of things that could happen. And so that is why we went down that path to emphasize this. And We did have leadership support to a point. And, don't get me wrong, we took the crawl, walk, run approach. We just didn't get to full-scale exercises overnight. We did a lot of tabletop discussion exercises and got a lot of good things out of that. And probably the best thing that we did was invite local law enforcement to come in and be part of those conversations. So we weren't guessing about what the response time would be, or once law enforcement got there, what are they going to do? If it's just people from your company, you're going to have all kinds of wonderful people making educated guesses about what they think is going to happen, as opposed to what is actually going to happen. So that became sort of the foundation for what we do or started doing. And then it just morphed. And again, it's all about leadership buy-in and using strategic opportunities to convince your VPs and other senior leaders that this is worthwhile. And we had for us, a tabletop exercise where a sergeant from the Tewksbury Police Department pointed at our CFO and said, "You need to do active shooter or active assailant training, and we can help you." And sometimes the message delivered by someone in uniform is more effective than me or someone else in business resiliency or continuity delivering the message or asking 10 or 20 times. And that really started us down the path of functional exercises. And once leadership saw that we could execute those safely and securely, they gave us more levity to try more and do more. All within confines of, again, continuing operations without disruption and no one getting hurt and nothing bad happening. So again, that was sort of our crawl, walk, run approach to it. And, I can say we've done 4 or 5 either, full-scale active assailant drills or site lockdown drills.
David, I'm going to take it back from you here for just a moment because we're actually going to lose Ryan. And so I want to ask Ryan before he has to jump off. What didn't I ask you about active assailant training that you think is critical for this audience to know?
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. I was, David just reminded me of something when he was speaking there about getting, executive buy-in. So, convincing management or convincing your constituents. I just like, I could simplify it into what I consider like the 5 key kind of actions that you could take or you could partner with someone on. And then I have just a quick commentary on the effects of the pandemic, if I may.
Absolutely.
But, first, obviously I've talked about OSHA. There's standards and guidelines that exist. So use those. There's the OSHA Workplace Violence Inspection Guideline, and the American Society of Industrial Security and Society of Human Resources has a standard for workplace violence. So there are standards that exist that talk about training, and that you can show them. Second is obviously to build a coalition. You hear about this all the time, but getting the support from legal, HR, HS&E, your business continuity folks, even if it's just 1 or 2 of those that you can start to sway. And I would also say you don't always have to start at the C-suite. A lot of the executives are going to look to their deputies or their second in commands or their subject matter experts for, should we be doing this? So you can start a grassroots campaign within your organization that doesn't include the C-suites to start to build that bench strength to get, buy-in. Third, we mentioned at the very beginning, benchmark, community of practice. What is everybody in your sector doing? So get that data, get those measurements. Certainly using IFMA Boston's a great avenue to do that with all of your peers, so you can bring that to the table. Fourth would be to use data, not emotion. So using the statistics that are out there, using stories like doing a crisis exercise like David mentioned and showing them the gaps. The biggest one for me when we were trying to convince people was that 60% of the incidents end before the police get there. So that means you need to equip your people to know what to do before they get there, so that usually equates to training. So that was the biggest statistic we tried to use to help sell the program. And then lastly, sometimes people get stuck just on active shooter, but you can explain it addresses a broader range of risks to include, vehicle incidents, suspect at large, using the protests and the riots that are going on right now to just talk about what if this is outside our front door. It doesn't have to be an employee or disgruntled employee type of threat. It's all those types of threats that can turn into violence that affects your facility. So those would be the five.
We are running out of time. I want to ask this, Ryan, before we go, because I think it's critically important. The pandemic has stirred up a cauldron of emotions and anxieties and stresses. Talk to me about what our audience should know as they start to return.
Yeah, I mean, so some of this is conjecture and some of it's just articles, but we're already starting to see it. It's a different movement, a different reason entirely, but obviously the protests and riots that are going on related to the George Floyd incident has some element of pent-up frustration and some element of mental health issues that we are seeing and what people are taking advantage of and turning that into something different. There's valid protests, obviously, that we respect and that are going on, but there are certain elements that are turning that into a chance to execute extra criminal activity and violence. So I think there was also a surge in gun sales pre-COVID, or when COVID started in March and April. Gun sales went up 71% and 85% respectively in those months. So the weapon stockpiling was going on. And then on the end of that, on the heels of that, you're going to face all these mental health issues, which we know are percolating. So I think when people are reoccupying the office and coming back, I'm not going to say that the incidents are going to increase, but there's certainly this added stress, this added mental health layer, which certainly correlates to active assailant type issues and incidents. So something to watch out for and be prepared for as we come out of it.
Absolutely. And we weren't able to get to it today, but there is a lot of preparation that actually precedes the training component of it, and has to do with identification of potential risks. We talk a lot in the podcast about that. I think that there is training that can happen, and we provided additional resources. So I do encourage everybody to listen. Janessa, I think we're out of time. Is that true?
One question that kind of goes in general between probably Ashley and these folks that we could just finish off with. Again, we asked in our poll and also in chat if people are doing an active assailant, which was one of the questions on Hova. But another one is, how often do you reassess your plan? And that goes, I think, across these risk factors. It's not something I think that you probably just one and done and put away. How often are you going back to these plans?
For business continuity best practice is at least annually, and it might be more often if you have a critical process.
Thank you. Dan, David, do you want to take that last question too?
Yeah, and I'll take it from a different perspective, which is, planning a full-scale active assailant drill. So we do after action reports and evaluate. Actually, we invite the police or law enforcement in, feed them, and then I'll typically get up there and ask questions of the participants, law enforcement, and evaluators that we had stationed to see what they saw and what they observed, and if they found any gaps that we could address. And then our last one that we did at Andover, at our largest manufacturing facility, we actually did an after-action report for the planning. So I led the planning team over a course of a couple months, and we said, well, what did we miss? What can we do better? What are our timelines for actually putting on one of these from start to finish? What can we improve on? So always great to look at what you're doing and how you can do it better, what gaps you can identify and how you can address those to do things in a better fashion.
Thank you. I want to thank all of my experts for both participating in the podcast and in today's FM Forward event. Your expertise is incredible, and we could have, whole days where we talk about just these subjects, on their own. They're so rich with information. So thank you for sharing your expertise. And I'll turn it back over to Tom.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, everyone on the panel. I think it's quite clear in the questions coming into the chat and into Huva that you're absolutely right, Jackie. We could talk for hours on this one, and there's all sorts of opportunities to continue this conversation throughout our chapter and amongst your own networking. So please, we encourage you to do that. That's what this is all about. Being cognizant of everyone's time, we are a couple minutes over, but let me just bring things to a close by saying thank you for joining us today. Thank you for all those who presented and those who in VVA and others who participated in our exhibitor and sponsorship of this event. I will mention that we keep pushing you to go to the Huva app to talk with your peers and with our exhibitors, but also there's an opportunity for some prizes. Later in the week, we're going to be rewarding the top leaders on the communication board. We did that last year. It was a lot of fun, so we're going to be doing that again this year. So we encourage you to post everything you do in the app, gets you credit. So keep that up. And then please be free. Remember to join us tomorrow, right back here at noon. You have been sent an additional link for day 3. Tomorrow's Tech Talk is another exciting one, taking us in a different direction, though. We're going to be talking about innovative work order management with the team from the Harlow, as well as a best practices session with John Hancock and the Manulife team about their recent consolidation. That's going to give you a lot to think about as you start to make and continue to make adjustments in your own real estate future. So with that being said, thanks again for a great day 2, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.